Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your business, specifically for PE portfolio companies and VC portfolio companies. And every Tuesday and Thursday, I have a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build a company filled with rockstars. And I'm joined by a very, very interesting CEO today of a very interesting business, perhaps one of Chicago's fastest growing SaaS companies, and he's going to tell us a bit about it. Glenn Trout is the CEO, the president of VelocityEHS, and he's been for almost 20 years now, pretty unusual in terms of CEO tenure. He's going to tell us the story of Velocity and how he's done it. VelocityEHS is a 500-person leader in environmental health and safety. So if you have employees that deal with products and environmental health and safety and sustainability is an issue, then you're probably using his company's software. They were acquired by CVC, one of the leading investors in private equity. And with all that said, Glenn Trout, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
It's great to have you on. So why don't we start just a high level, 60 seconds. Tell us a bit about VelocityEHS for listeners that aren't in that space or don't work in that space.
So VelocityEHS is an environmental, as Jeff said, an environmental health and safety software company. It's 100% SaaS software, and we help companies comply with OSHA and EPA laws. So we help them operate a more environmentally friendly environment and a safer work environment.
So if I have, I don't know, paints or chemicals or anything that my employees touch, I'm required by law to do what?
So if you have hazardous chemicals is a good example. We have about 15 modules. Chemical management is one of our larger ones. If you use hazardous chemicals in the workplace, you're required by law to share those hazards, or the hazards associated with those chemicals, with your workers. So with the people who are handling, storing, disposing, using those chemicals in the workplace. And you do that by sharing that via safety labels and safety data sheets so that the employee knows how to handle and dispose of the chemical properly. And we have a database of about 15 million SDSs to help people do that.
What is an SDS?
So that's a safety data sheet. It used to be called a material safety data sheet.
15 million, did you say?
Yes, yeah.
So those are 15 million different like chemicals and what?
Yeah, so there's a safety data sheet for every chemical manufacturer in the country is required by law to disclose the hazards associated with their chemicals to their customers.
Got it.
So every chemical manufacturer has to write an SDS for all of their chemicals. We also write SDSs here. We have people that help our clients write SDSs, if you will. But so by law, they've got to share those hazards to their customers so that they know how to protect themselves using those chemicals. And we have a database of 15 million of those. So whether it's from acetone, WD-40, even kind of common household products, if they're used in an industrial setting.
Or they can react with each other if they're not stored properly or whatever.
Exactly. And bad things happen, right? And, unfortunately, with a lot of these, especially chemical exposures, they're not necessarily acute. So somebody can actually be exposed to a chemical and then they have a problem 10 years down the road.
Got it.
So there's a lot of complications around complying with this law. For instance, you have to keep an SDS for 30 years in most environments.
Got it. So, now I can understand why I need a SaaS platform to track all this stuff, right? I assume before this, people were using pen and paper, folders, or nothing.
Yeah, that's right. Keeping paper binders around full of these documents. And the average SDS is about 6 to 7 pages. So literally shelves and shelves and shelves full of these documents. So that's an example of one of our products. That's one of our more popular products, actually.
Without going into numbers, I won't put you on the spot for revenue or anything, but can you give a sense of how big the business is in terms of number of customers or countries or anything?
So we have about 18,000 customers. We are probably in virtually every country, but about 90 to 95% of our revenue originates in North America. So it's sold to U.S. and Canadian companies mostly, but 40% of our users actually reside outside of North America. So
these are global companies, right? International.
Yeah, exactly. So big multinational companies using our product. 18,000 customers, about 500 employees. I think we're up to about 8 million users actually. So our customers have thousands and thousands of employees, and those thousands of employees are actually using our products in the workforce.
So we're going to focus on the people part of all this, like you said, about 500 people. But just for shits and giggles, when you joined the company, you were a founder or you joined an existing company?
I was a founder.
Okay.
Well, it's a fun, complicated story. We were part of a .com that failed. I actually was an employee of the .com, and we were selling commodities over the web. The company was called FOB.com. Anybody who has been in Chicago for 20 years might remember that.
Yeah.
If you were in the software space. We raised a bunch of money. We were selling commodities over the web. FOB Chemicals was our biggest one, and we actually had we bought this little free website called MSDS Online, and they didn't really have software, what you would describe, certainly we would describe as SaaS software.
Yeah.
And we would call our customers and say, we bought MSDS Online because they had, I think at the time, 400,000 registered users. Those are people that went online to look for an SDS. And we had this bright idea, we'll buy this little company and we'll sell their users chemicals, because we pick up the phone and say, hey, Jeff, I noticed you're on our website looking for an MSDS for acetone. We sell acetone. Would you like to buy acetone from us? And you would say, no.
Yeah.
I'm a safety professional. I just
Right.
work here.
It was the wrong target. But it was the right idea that it was a great adjacent category. And now that you've got a sales force strapped into this thing, it's like a rocket ship.
Yeah, well, yeah. What happened is you would go on to say, no, I'm not the buyer of these chemicals, but I have a problem with these SDSs. That's why I was on your website. Can you help me with that?
Got it.
And that's how the business was really born.
I always love the origin story of these companies that kind of come out of nowhere. No one's heard of it, and yet it's got millions and millions of revenue, or tens or hundreds of million revenue. So, okay, so you're at this about 20 years.
Yep.
I assume you have learned and made every mistake in the book with regard to people and talent, recruiting, retention, culture, leadership. Let's just touch on some of them. We've only got about 15 minutes or so, but let's start with culture. So you started with what, 5, 10 people, 20 people?
About 5, yeah. Well, when the FOB company shrunk down to about 5 people. And that's when we restarted at 5. Yeah, that's right.
So you start from 5, you're at 500. Tell us a bit about how culture evolves when you think about that exponential increase, and specifically, if you could go back in time with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you would do differently back then to prepare the culture for the people growth of the business?
Yeah, I think some of the things I would have done differently, I would say I would have gone faster, actually.
In terms of what?
Well, and just in terms of growing the business, we were a little cautious. And of course, we didn't know, right? We didn't know how big the market was.
Yeah.
And we took kind of an approach, because we didn't know what we were dealing with. And because I think some of this, we lived through some trauma. So during the FOB days, we got up to about 250 employees, and we went down to 5. So I fired a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right.
Just layoffs, I assume.
Yeah. But I mean, it was pretty traumatic, right?
Yeah, so sure. You don't want to do that again.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, the culture of FOB was pretty good. Like, we had really, really good people. I think, luckily for me, some of the founder of FOB, who was, I was one of the founders, but I was more of a co-founder. He recognized the bubble burst before anybody else. So we were able to package people out, but It was still traumatic. It was still not great news.
So that stuck with you as you built the business and Velocity. You didn't want to ever have to do that again.
Yeah, exactly. And I also wanted to be very upfront and honest with people, saying, hey, listen, if you join us, listen, we're not getting married. We're just dating, because I'm not 100% sure this is going to work. Yeah. Right. So we took a very cautious. The other thing is we didn't have any money. Right. Yeah. So you tend to be more cautious when you don't have money. But I also think that, in the early days, we probably took some shortcuts that I would not take today.
Give us an example.
So an example of that would be, when we hired the first class of salespeople that I hired, because we were literally running out of money. I called a temp agency that did, I think it was mostly telemarketers selling like credit card services. Yep. Back in the day when Do Not Call was before Do Not Call wasn't the thing. Yep. And I hired all these people that were really good on the phone. They were tended to be older, like my age, mid 50s. Yep. And really good on the phone. They did not know technology at all. Right. So I gave them a script, kind of trained them, got them on the phones. Our product was pretty simple, especially in the early days. Turned them loose, and only one of them worked out. Right?
Because they couldn't even answer the basic questions from a prospect.
Right. They didn't know the difference between the internet and an intranet. In
Yeah.
some cases, they didn't know how to send an email.
Yeah.
If they did know how to send an email, they didn't know how to send an attachment.
Yeah.
So it was all of these things. But one of the guys worked, and one of the people in that class worked, and he happened to be right out of college. And he was the most technical of the bunch.
So he was like a digital native at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's probably more technical than me, frankly, in hindsight. But so I quickly shifted the model there, and we started going after folks that were right out of school.
So the lesson learned there was or the shortcut that you were alluding to was thinking that you could take experienced people who were successful in another industry and throw them at it, and they would replicate that success.
Right. That's exactly right.
Got it. And it turns out kids out of school are much less expensive, which was a nice benefit again.
That's right. And I think the other one mistake I made there, though, it took me too long to figure out. So I started hiring kind of right out of school. We still were doing the temp thing because we didn't have any money. And I wouldn't, if I had money, I wouldn't have done that. I would have gone probably a little bit more aggressively on recruiting. We've done a better job of, I think, defining what works here and what doesn't work here. And so I guess if I'm being fair to ourselves, we didn't really know the model. We didn't have a great idea of what it was going to take to be successful here. But I think we shot too low in the early days.
How long did it take of the 20 years since you started? When did you feel like, okay, we understand the model, we know what business we're in, we got product market fit? How long did that take?
Probably 3 years.
Got it.
Took 3 years of kind of trial and error, fired too many people, a lot of broken china, bring people in big classes, and just throw them to the wolves, right? We didn't do a whole lot of training.
Right.
And really only the strong survived. We lost some good people because we did not have, I'd say, the training programs in place. Certainly didn't have tools like Salesforce.com.
Sure.
Didn't really exist in the way they exist today.
Sure. So I appreciate your candor with that, because so many companies, as soon as they get some success, they throw bodies at it, and it doesn't always work. In fact, more often than not, it doesn't work. When did you really codify the culture, the DNA, the values of the place? And by that, I mean not the bullshit list of values on the wall, but the non-negotiable DNA of the company. Was it around that same 3-year mark, or did that take longer?
No, I think, well, it certainly has taken longer. It's still going on, right? Yeah. So I would say a lot of that, in my experience, has been leadership by example. So when somebody does break a golden rule, that there actually is some,
consequence.
There's consequences, and really living the values and trying to make sure that we do live our values. That I would say. In the early days, when you're figuring things out, maybe it's a little sloppier.
Mm-hmm. You're okay looking the other way on occasion.
Yeah, and especially before you have things figured out, right? Like what really is going to work here.
Yeah.
In terms of what I would describe our core values, I mean, we had some challenges with whether it be integrity with employees or something like that. That's generally. We take a fairly hard line on that.
Right.
That sort of stuff.
What's an example, without naming names, what's an example of, I would think, selling a SaaS platform? How can someone have what's an example of an integrity issue, and what was the consequence?
Well, so I'll give you one example. We had a salesperson very early in our history, certainly within the first 2 years. And she was very effective and a hard worker. Right. And very aggressive. A lot of things I absolutely loved about her. But an example of one of the things that she did was, if a client would say, I'm not going to purchase this product, she would threaten to call OSHA on them. Right. So,
wow.
Yeah,
that's a big integrity issue.
Yeah. That's a really, so I will say she did have enough integrity to say, when I questioned her on it, she said, "Oh yeah, I did that." So,
wow.
I think with her, some of it was a little bit of an education, right? Because she didn't come from the industry, and, but that's a prime example. So we coached around that, but it definitely becomes, 2 or 3 strikes you're out. A lot of the folks that we've hired here have been right out of school, so maybe they don't have, a really deep, kind of understanding of exactly what is kind of acceptable, what's not acceptable. Although I will say most people do.
Whatever you had to put in place to help these folks right out of school learn the basics. I find when I've done that in the past, they don't even know how to tie their shoes or dress for work or behave themselves in a professional way, which you wouldn't expect because they're young and out of school. What have you put in place to accelerate that learning curve?
So one of the things, training is a huge piece of this. So we've got really, really strong trainers. So every one of our salespeople comes in, they get certified. They get certified in kind of bits and pieces. So you don't on day 3, you're not going to be an expert on, SARA reporting, which is a pretty serious topic that requires some expertise. That takes a long time. But you can become an expert on, potentially, well, certainly understanding the industry, who OSHA is, the basis of what we do, and also potentially on maybe setting a demo, right? So taking little bite-sized chunks, and we certify our people and have levels of certification that go up and down our product offering.
When did you decide to make that investment in training along the 20-year spectrum of the business?
So I did all the training, I would say, for the first 8 years. And then it was kind of a train the trainer. So then we kind of had team leads, and then they would train. So we went to a pod model, which I think was very, very helpful.
Now you have dedicated trainers, I assume?
Oh yeah, now we have a full-blown dedicated training staff. Yeah, so and we made that probably around the 8th year in. I'd say around 30 salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
We also have trainers on other sides of our business for the implementation team. So I'm not counting those trainers. They're all kind of part of the same general functional team. But
sales sounds like it's roughly.
And we train people on sales skills, basic sales skills. Some schools actually have some pretty decent sales training. So we have some folks that join us that actually have had a little bit of experience, which is nice. But we train them on sales skills, certainly product, the industry, our customer demographics.
There's a lot to know. There's a lot to know, especially in a legal compliance type of industry.
Absolutely.
So you've grown also through acquisition, not just organic. And so I just wanted to touch on that before we wrap up, Glenn. Roughly along the way, how many acquisitions has the business done, roughly?
So I think we've probably done about 8 acquisitions. I would describe half of them as customer acquisitions, where basically we had a small competitor that we probably were fairly friendly with, and they just said, hey, listen, we're going to get out of this business. Can we sell our book of business to you? And in most of those cases, their platforms were much less capable than ours, so it was a pretty easy one. We just upgraded their customers to our platform.
And you weren't even keeping their staff, really?
No, they were generally, except one of those, we actually kept their staff, which is great. Well, actually 2 of them, and now that I think of it, we kept some of their staff.
So what did you learn from the experience of the acquisitions where you did keep the staff in terms of integrating cultures? Any advice for listeners who are thinking about buying a company or partnering or merging with a company when it comes to integrating the team?
Yes. I will say this. It's very, very important to us. And with all of the acquisitions we've done, we have known the teams for quite some time. We're pretty active in the marketplace, working with partners. In many cases, we actually partner with the acquisition first to see how the teams work together, certainly how the management team works together. Because for us in our industry, most of the acquisitions that we've done have actually been additional modules or domain expertise that falls outside of ours. So it's really important that we keep the team. We're not doing acquisitions for synergies where we're going to let people go. So it's critical to us that the cultures actually work. We spend a lot of time understanding that. So we try not to, so far, I'm knocking on wood here a little bit, but so far we haven't done any acquisitions where it hasn't been a good cultural fit.
How did you assess the culture before how did you know? But presumably before you did the deal, you assessed the culture. How do you assess a culture?
I think it starts with the leadership. So really getting to know the leaders. And I will say, there's a lot of leaders in our space that I really like and trust.
Mm-hmm.
It really comes down to that.
Yeah.
Then you can have an open and honest conversation, right? Yeah. I will say I've had experiences where that wasn't there. So those conversations just, it's
a non-starter.
It's a non-starter. I don't care how good of a multiple we could get on a business. If we don't trust the team, we're out.
You ever have an issue where an investor or the board said, we really think you should combine or buy this company, but for you it was a non-starter because there was a cultural disconnect and you really kind of had to explain that to the investors? Not
in a long time. So I would say in the very, very early days, kind of in the venture days, we had, and this was kind of through tough times during what I would describe as the dot-com bust.
Yeah,
there were a lot of deals out there.
I'm sure
there were a lot, and frankly, these weren't really cultural mismatches. We had a couple investors that wanted us to slam together with businesses that the businesses didn't even fit together.
Yeah,
so I had to argue fairly hard. I think one of the things when you have some success, sometimes your investors think you can fix anything.
Right.
And I'm like, well, I don't even understand this, so how can I fix it?
Well, I'm not a magician, right?
I'm not a magician. So we've been very disciplined about only buying businesses that fit our customer view.
Yeah.
So if it's something, so let's say, we're in environmental health and safety. So we're calling on health and safety professionals generally. We're not going to buy a business that calls on the marketing department of that company.
Right.
So been very disciplined about staying in our lane, and it's worked. So I think we've done a great job, not only creating a great culture here, our team has created a great relationship in the marketplace. So generally, we have a bit of a halo effect. Once if you take care of your customers, you offer an additional product or solution, they'll take a look at you if you've taken care of them.
One last question before we wrap up, Glenn, and that's the effect of private equity on the business. You raised capital. CVC is now the primary investor, terrific PE fund. How does private equity change, or does it, the people part of the business? For a listener that's maybe thinking about raising private equity or selling to private equity, there's a lot of ways it probably wouldn't change, but how might it change?
So the good news or the interesting thing for us is we've always been backed by private equity or venture capital. So
from the beginning.
From the very beginning. So we've had a little bit of an inside view of this, I would say. It definitely, I actually love having professional management on the board, meaning professional investors on the board.
Yep.
It's a different perspective. They bring an outside perspective. I will say I've had good ones and bad ones. I literally had people back in the venture days come into our meetings and say, hey, Glenn, we were just at Netflix and Netflix is doing this, so I think you ought to do that. And I'm like, whoa, we're not Netflix, and it's not even the same. It's not even remotely.
We're not even consumer, right?
Yeah, same model. So we had some of that. So that can be bad.
Yeah.
I will say, private equity in general, while they're all the same in terms of they're in the same business, there's very different cultures within private equity.
So you need to find one that matches yours, or complements, or what?
And for me, what it really matches, and you can be tricked by this, but CVC is a great example. So we, not unlike an acquisition, I've known CVC for at least 4 years. They reached out to us, and so I take meetings with private equity, get to know your investors
ahead of the deal,
way ahead of the deal.
Yeah.
Meet with as many as you can. Get to know them. You will figure out, I think, at least for us, we figured out pretty quickly. And usually they're pretty honest with you. Some of them will tell, listen, we have a playbook. Part of our playbook is we plan on taking out 20% of the spend, 30% of the spend. We're focused on that.
Yeah.
Versus CVC, what resonated with us is they really understood our market. They understood our competitors. They also understood who we don't compete with, which is different than a lot of the other folks I had talked about. And they're also all about growth.
Yeah.
We were very much about growth. It's a great market. We're shooting for to continue to grow and shoot for the stars.
And
rocket
you
ship.
can't gain that understanding if you're in the heat of the deal.
That's right.
To your point, it took 4 years for you to really get to know them.
That's right. Now, reality here is, and if you are owned by private equity being sold to private equity, you don't always control it. So when we were sold to CVC, we were owned by a public company, and they were selling us.
Right.
I could influence the discussion and voice my opinion, but I didn't control that deal. So, but if you are raising money for the first go round, I had a pretty big voice on who we went to, because our original investors, and of which I was one, and it was a more significant one. The original investors were very interested in what we wanted to do too. They had to get out because their fund was closing, but I had a really nice chance to meet with multiple private equity funds, and I got to vote, and that's who we ended up going with, ICG at the time. It was a great decision for us.
Well, it's very wise counsel. Glenn, I give you a ton of credit. This is one of Chicago's true success stories in technology. A lot of people have never heard of it, but that's changing.
We did that on purpose. We really, that's the other bit of advice. We flew below the radar for a long time.
And there's a lot to be said for that.
Oh yeah, we did not want our competitors to know what we were doing.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden they wake up and we have 18,000 customers and
500 people.
Yeah, exactly. So, but now we're out there. We in that window of about 5 years where we were owned by a public company, it kind of got pretty public. So
good. Well, I give you a lot of credit. Thanks so much for making the time. We really appreciate it. How can people learn more about Velocity or get in touch?
Well, if you're the folks on this line, if you're in Chicago, we'd love to talk to you, and just give us. My name is Glenn Trout, and my email is gtrout@EHS, like Echo Hotel Sierra, Environmental Health and Safety.com.
That's easy.
gtrout@EHS.com. Drop me an email, and happy to talk. And certainly, if we've got any environmental health and safety professionals out there looking for a platform.
If you're not on this platform, you soon will be.
You probably already know who we are, but if not, please call me.
Great. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank you, Jeff.